Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay, here to do another video, a sad one, unfortunately, about the passing of a civil rights icon, Jesse Louis Jackson. Um, yeah, I- Not a lot needs to be said about Reverend Jackson and what he meant to the United States history. I call him the first African American, in a sense, because it was during his campaign in 1984 that the term African American was first popularized. Um, he began to use this term as opposed to the term that was before that, which was Afro American or Black American, and before that, you know, Negro, colored, and all the other words that we now consider derogatory. Now, many people have an issue with this phraseology. Many people, even on the channel, they don't like this phraseology as it stands right now. People prefer to going back to the original term, black, which was, what was used before, but or Black American. Some say foundational Black American, FBA, American descendants of slaves is another one that is used. These different terms to refer to the individuals who are of African descent, who are descendants of the enslaved population here in the states. So that was one of Jesse Jackson's first, one of his legacies. But let's really go through his life, you know, as it stands. He was born in 1941, October 8th, 1941. And an interesting tidbit about him, his mother was 18 years old and his father was in his 30s. So he was born of an extramarital affair that his father had had. He was born in Greenville, North Carolina. Um, and because of this, he was teased. He was teased, by the other kids because he was born of an extramarital affair. Because this was, the 50s and stuff. It wasn't common at this time to, families were intact. It was a different social environment. The 1950s that he was born in, it wasn't, like it is today. That would be fairly common. But he then has a stepfather, and that's where he takes on the name of his stepfather, the last name Jackson. He has a baseball scholarship initially, but he a chance to enter into minor league baseball, but he turns that down because he wants to go to college, where he goes to college on a football scholarship to the University of Illinois, one of the few black students that got a scholarship, to a predominantly white institution. After that, though, he transfers to A&T University, a predominantly black HBCU college. And in the mid 1960s, this is when he becomes, like 1965-ish, he becomes involved with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The march, Selma and Montgomery, those marches in Alabama that Dr. King is a part of when he's in college. When Jesse Jackson is in college, he studies divinity, so is where he becomes a pastor. But is in politics where he really gains his footing. He becomes a star in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to such an extent that they send him to Chicago to be the head of their department in Chicago, Illinois. The headquarters down there. And of course, he's with Dr. King in 1968 when Dr. King is assassinated. In fact, he even says, according to Reverend Jackson, he was there when Dr. King, he held Dr. King in his arms, as Dr. King was dying. Dr. King's family, they dispute that. They say that isn't true. But anyway, that is the narrative that Reverend Jackson is going with. In 1971, he founds the organization PUSH. On Christmas Day, 1971, PUSH is People United to Save Humanity. And from there, that then snowballs into the Rainbow Coalition. And like I said, he was very critical of the Reagan administration. He led several boycotts, including the boycott in 1983 of the Anheuser-Busch organization. Anheuser-Busch, which is Budweiser, right? They weren't hiring a lot of black employees, so he led the boycott. His son Yusuf and his other son Jonathan were involved with that boycott, and later that became, an avenue. They eventually hired a lot of other black people. He was very critical, like I said, of the Reagan administration, and in 1984 he begins his first run for president. He comes in third, right behind Walter Mondale, who eventually became the nominee for the 1984, the Democratic nominee. We talked a little bit about this particular campaign, where he was very successful. The slogan "Run, Jesse, Run," because he had a lot of steam. He'd been in politics since the early 70s. He basically took over and became the successor to Dr. King after Dr. King was assassinated. So he'd been very prolific. People wanted him to run. He had a huge following among not just black people, but poor people, Hispanics, all kinds of other minorities. People were really getting behind him. And his slogan was, "I am somebody," right? I am somebody. He had so much momentum. But what eventually happened was, well, it was a leaked conversation saying that he couldn't, him expressing concerns that he probably couldn't win New York because it was Town. And he was one of the first people in politics at that time to directly support Palestinian rights. And he felt like that would anger a lot of the Jewish base within the Democratic Party. He says this to a reporter, it gets leaked. Then Reverend Jackson gets branded by the Jewish community in New York City as an anti-Semite, as somebody who was against Jewish people. And that really hampers and handicaps his campaign. He got several threats from prominent Jewish politicians, including the mayor of New York at that time, Mayor Ed Koch. And that begins the alliance between himself and the Nation of Islam leader, Louis Farrakhan, who comes to his defense and aid. But like I said, Reverend Jackson comes he comes in third in the 1984 election. Not to be deterred, he comes back in 1988. This time, he loses the nomination to Massachusetts Senator Michael Dukakis. And he doesn't Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis, right? He doesn't do as well in 1988, but he still has a lot of momentum. So by 1991, they think by 1990, 192, they think he's going to run again. He doesn't. He becomes the shadow senator for Washington, D.C., where he serves He serves on the Senate from there from 1991 to 1997, uh, establishing that position for the first time ever. You know, nobody had ever nobody had ever held that position before, right? So that's what he does. What he does there. In 2008, he became under a lot of controversy. Barack Obama was, of course, running. Jesse Jackson set the tone. He was the first Barack Obama in many ways. I mean, I know Shirley Chisholm, uh, ran in 1972 as the first black person ever to run for president. But, she didn't really have a lot of support. Reverend Jackson was the first serious candidate, and Al Sharpton, of course, ran in 2000. But Reverend Jackson was really the first serious candidate that was a black person to run for president. So he was the Obama before Obama in many ways. So he came under controversy during that campaign because he was having a private conversation. Again, Reverend Jackson got caught in this, just like in 1984 when he was having a private conversation. And he said he happened to whisper over to the next person that Obama looks down his nose at other black people and that Obama talks white, right? So he came under some controversy for that, for those comments, towards President Obama. But in the end, he supported as a member of the Democratic Party, Barack Obama. And during the speech after Obama won, he was seen crying hysterically. I remember joking at that time, watching it on TV. I said, he's not crying because he's happy that Obama won the first black president. He's actually really crying because he wished it was him, right? Out of jealousy. You know what I mean? Because he came so close, but then he didn't win. In 84, especially in 84. That was when he really had the momentum. He was the first black person to speak to the state legislature in Alabama since the end of Reconstruction in the 1870s. So he really made a lot of headway. In 2001, he had a sex scandal that rocked him. He was accused of having extramarital affairs and stuff like that. So he came under fire for that. But that didn't really affect him. And then, after that, he kind of faded into the background. He wasn't as prolific as he used to be. Like when I was a kid growing up, because, being a child of the 1980s and 90s, it was, in terms of civil rights, it was three icons. It was himself, Al Sharpton, and Louis Farrakhan that were the three icons, the three pillars of black politics, kind of the successors to the likes of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And he was the first one to pass away of this newer generation. Because you could look at kind of like Louis Farrakhan was the successor in many ways to Malcolm X, and Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton were the successors to Martin Luther King Jr. Now, Reverend Jackson passes away. Minister Farrakhan is still alive, and Reverend Al is still alive. When these individuals pass away, there is nobody else. There's not that next generation. Who are we going to call on? Umar Johnson, Tariq Nasheed. These people, there's not that generation anymore of civil rights leaders. Some would say that is not needed anymore. You know what I mean? Like you had them before Martin Luther King. You had Ralph Abernathy, you had A. Philip Randolph, you had Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois. These individuals. Some would say that, and then you had Dr. King and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Elijah Muhammad, right? And Paul Robeson. But some would say, like I said, that's not needed anymore. You don't need black civil rights leaders. But I would beg to differ. I think there are issues within the black community that need to be addressed. You need to bring these issues to politicians and hold their feet to the fire in the way that a Frederick Douglass did for Abraham Lincoln, or in a way that Martin Luther King Jr. did for LBJ and JFK, in the way that Reverend Jackson did for Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. The black community still needs this sort of representation. Reverend Jackson, of course, very prolific with the Million Man March in 1995, along with Minister Farrakhan. So he definitely will be missed on the scene, on the political scene. His son, Jesse Jackson Jr., is involved with politics, and I believe he served on the Senate in the state of Illinois as well. Illinois, of course, the kind of the headquarters of the Rainbow Coalition, the Push Coalition. Reverend Jackson, too, was heavily involved with international politics. You know, he was one of the first U.S. politicians to go over to Libya, one of the first U.S. politicians to secure the release of Robert Goodman from Syria, you know, back in the 1970s. So he's very heavily involved with international politics as well as domestic politics, especially with poor people. He helped lead the Poor People March that Martin Luther King was organizing in the late 60s, before Martin Luther King's passing. So like I said, I always look at him as the successor to Martin Luther King Jr. Like, Martin Luther King Jr. died and he gave the baton to Reverend Jesse Jackson. So there's nobody else now. You know, you know what I'm saying? Reverend Al Sharpton, Louis Farrakhan, and Jesse Jackson, those three were the last three civil rights leaders, in a sense. You know what I mean? Like I said, we can't look to Tariq Nasheed or Omar Johnson, these individuals, to be representatives. These are clowns on the internet. You know what I'm saying? They're not boots on the ground the way that Reverend Jackson was, boots on the ground the way that Reverend Al is, and the way that Louis Farrakhan is. They're not like that. You know what I'm saying? They're not leading the push, pun intended, for that in terms of black politics. You know? And, you know, it's just sad because I feel like that is still needed. You know, you do have organizations like Tamika Mallory and with Black Lives Matter and stuff, but Black Lives Matter and these organizations, they don't have the kind of charismatic leadership that was typical for Black Americans, you know, going back to, like I said, Frederick Douglass, you know, days. But yeah, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Rest in peace to Reverend Jackson. His legacy will always be felt. I remember him, like I say, he was the most prolific black leader when I was a kid growing up. Because, you know, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, that was before my time. I studied them in history class, but I didn't experience them. But Reverend Jackson, I did experience. And he broadened the appeal of civil rights activism, kind of carrying on the dream of Martin Luther King after Martin Luther King's assassination. I am somebody. You know, rest in peace, Reverend Jackson.